Today is a significant date, the 5th anniversary of the release of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. To mark its importance, Mike DeGagné, President and CEO of Indspire, is sharing some good conversation with Shelagh Rogers, honorary witness to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Chancellor of the University of Victoria, member of the Métis Nation, award-winning journalist, and host of CBC's The Next Chapter. They'll be discussing the TRC's calls to action and the work that still needs to be done.
Well, it's so good to see you, Sheila.
You know, this is one of the advantages of our technology, isn't it? We have to be grateful for it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's the real upside. So here we are, and we are reflecting on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, now 5 years on. And so I thought I would ask you a few questions and answer a few questions about where we were then, what your reflections were on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as you were witness to it. Later to talk about perhaps where we are now, 5 years on, and where we think the TRC has set us up to go. So I remember you as an honorary witness at every event, often pressed into service in terms of your master's ceremonies and facilitating what were very, very challenging conversations and sometimes very uplifting and hopeful conversations. So I thought, why don't I just give you an opportunity to open up and say what you remember about those times 5 years ago at the TRC.
Well, just going back to exactly 5 years, I remember feeling this enormous sadness that these national events would be coming to an end because we were really building up a momentum. And I think that momentum has been carried on by the response to the calls to action. But if I were to go back to even before when the TRC lifted off, you, as the CEO and executive director of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, had a think tank on reconciliation in February of 2009.
Right.
And I took copious notes. You'd be amazed, but you'd have to pay me to see them, Mike. But one of the speakers was the late Elijah Harper, and he wanted to know who the TRC would report to, and will the stories that are collected gather dust? And I so wish that we could answer Elijah Harper and say, no, they didn't gather dust. They really meant something. And I think that, as you see, even territorial acknowledgements, which I know are somewhat controversial, people are thinking about where they live now. People are thinking about whose land they are living on. Right across the country, some places slower to start than others. I see, I give the TRC a lot of credit for that. The gatherings themselves were so powerful. Hearing the survivors speak their truth was an honor and a wake-up call. And it shook us, it stirred us as a country. It led our current Prime Minister to say that the most important relationship was with Indigenous people. I want to live in a country that lives up to what it says and what its promises are. But I think that before the TRC was like, Alka-Seltzer. Alka-Seltzer being dropped into the still water of Canada. And those gatherings had, I think, an enormous impact. What do you think?
I think I couldn't agree more. I think the gatherings were a real catalyst for all of us. Before that, of course, with treaty negotiations and policy discussions and various reports, we were always, as people who were working with Indigenous people and working in our communities, we were always trying to move the yardsticks forward. Mm-hmm. But we, in many ways, needed something to arrange ourselves around, something to dedicate ourselves to. And in a way, the Royal Commission report in the mid-90s was like that, and came out with, I still think was an outstanding report, probably the best of its kind to shed light on the Indigenous people of Canada. But the TRC, in a way, was allowed everyone to take action. We could attend. We could, as you said, offer a land acknowledgement. We could think about things in our own communities or our own workplaces and change policy. And so I remember being at the kickoff event. I remember being at the first event, listening to Blue Rodeo, and the interesting juxtaposition of a really wonderful, positive, hopeful night, and hearing stories that were really devastating during the day, and then moving on to the final event and the tabling of both the interim report and the final report. But yeah, I think it gave a lot of people, whether you were had dedicated your life to Indigenous issues or not, I think it gave us a focal point, a place where we could focus our energies and, in a way, both catalyze and then create a momentum for the next 5 years. So it was excellent.
I think so too. And as the events built, this sort of was like a snowball rolling down a hill that had snow on it. I want to add, it collected more and more snow. The last couple of events, I would say there were more non-Indigenous people in the audience than Indigenous people. That wasn't true at the beginning. So it felt as though the circle was being completed and people were really talking to each other. People who had been afraid to come at first because maybe they were ashamed or maybe they felt they were too ignorant of what had happened, the true history of Canada, began to feel that they were welcome, and they were. And they took what they heard at the gatherings, and everyone, in fact, was a witness. If you attended, you were a witness. And I really like your word attend, because it doesn't just mean to show up. It means to pay attention. And I think that these not, I don't, I'm just remembering somebody, a survivor named Joan, telling me in advance of the Victoria gathering, don't call them stories. They're statements. They're not stories. This really happened. This really happened. So listening to these statements and taking them in, and then as an honorary witness, absolutely having the responsibility to stand up for the truth. When you hear lies being spread, even in the highest chambers of our land, you stand up for the truth that you know to be real. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, and at the last gathering, this is my little notebook for the last gathering, Johnny Banksland, who is the late Johnny Banksland, an Inuvialuit elder, got up and he talked about how thrilled he was that his daughter and his grandchild were in the audience that day, and that they knew what had happened to old granddad for 15 years when he wasn't at home, when he was a child. But he also wanted to say to the Prime Minister, and I remember him looking at Justin Trudeau saying, this country is made of people, not just paper. Wow. And I think that's what those gatherings really showed, because we heard from people. We weren't just reading reports as we went along. The reports are very important, a very important permanent document. But that was really, really beautiful. And I remember Marie Wilson, one of the commissioners, saying later on that evening, keep talking about it so the country can't stop listening. And I thought that was really beautiful too. So many moments. I mean, I hope I wrote everything down correctly because they're really great quotes. And Murray Sinclair, former senator, saying, we cannot say that we are the same as when we started. We are not, and neither is this country.
Yeah.
So
that's a lovely summary. You have spoken to countless audiences in person, not even mentioning, a life in broadcasting, but and I've spoken to tons of audiences, whether they're in church basements or the elders' home or a university, right? And it doesn't matter where you go. Someone always says, "Wow, I have never heard that before. I never heard about residential school or the 60s scoop." And it's such a bewildering thing for many Canadians, and they often say, "How can I help? What contribution can I make?" And so in a way, the TRC allowed us to answer the question. Here's how can you help? Here's how you can help. You can make a contribution in the following way. And those contributions, I think, have been made in the last 5 years, towards moving us towards reconciliation. If you had to think about what you've seen happen in the last 5 years, from the end of the TRC to now, where do you think we've come? What have you seen happen that may not have happened otherwise?
I think we've seen more Indigenous faces in non-Indigenous spaces, and I think that's really great. I think representation is really, really important. I've seen some restructuring of systems that have really prevented Indigenous people from achieving full success. I've seen, because I work in the cultural sector as the host of a book program, enormous, an eruption, a volcano of Indigenous writing. The stories were always there. Now they're being published. And this whole bookcase, I don't know if you can see it behind me. I'm afraid to turn my computer because I have done this before and turned it off. So no, I don't want to do that. But Eden Robinson, Wabgishig Rice, the late Richard Wagamese, Cherie Demeline, seeing them on the bestseller lists, David Alexander Robertson, week after week after week, Jesse Thistle, it's unbelievable. It's not unbelievable. It's what should be. It feels so right. Indigenous musicians winning the Polaris Prize, Jeremy Dutcher, Buffy St. Marie. It's this explosion, and it's so exciting. And I think it has really revitalized the country culturally. The art, the visual art that's coming out, the films, the Imaginative Film Festival, such a great celebration of Indigenous storytelling and multimedia work. That thrills me. And these stories are really exciting. And people, I remember having a discussion with George LaFond in Saskatchewan when he was the treaty commissioner. And he was saying, there are just too many Indigenous stories that are about victimhood and the trauma. And I think, those stories needed to be told. And they needed to get into the hands of all Canadians. But I would say that the stories that are coming out now are moving beyond that. They're wild, dare I say, sometimes very sexy, and funny. There are just so many really good stories, great poetry being created. So that's from my bird's eye view. What about you? What have you seen?
Well, I've seen this fascinating attention paid to the 94 calls to action. So, I was really sort of two minds when I saw the final report, and you looked at all those calls. You think 94, that 94 is a very long list of priorities, but it really wasn't priorities, was it? It was a division of Canadian society into various sectors, and each sector was called to do something for Indigenous people, and not just for, but with, or even as Indigenous people, right? So the co-creation of something that would lead to reconciliation. So I was, when I look at it now, I see the sort of stroke of genius of calling people to act, and not just saying you should act, but to say, here's who you are. You are you're the business sector, you're the education sector, your government, and here's how you should act. Here are the deficits that are there that you need to apply yourself to make whole. So I think the 94 calls was really interesting. I'm still fascinated by how many certainly non-Indigenous industries and companies have just focused in on one or two of those recommendations and have really applied themselves to it. Even 5 years on, you'll see people with their little orange books that say, here are the 94 calls. And they'll say, well, we apply ourselves to 68 and we've done an excellent job, right? So in a way that those calls were a scorecard, were a call, and it gave people a certain sense of direction that I think Senator Sinclair referred to when he said, we will show you the mountain. Yeah. And you have to climb it, right? And so this was the mountain in many ways, the 94 calls. Yeah.
He did amend that to a mountain range.
Yeah, it's not always smooth.
And it's often one step forward, two steps back. But I think you're right. The 94 calls gave people something concrete to aim for. And I know many of them are directed to institutions and sectors of society, but even if you're not part of those sectors, I think it calls on all Canadians to support people who are doing that work, because it really will change the country. It really will. And it already is. It's lifting us up. So those calls are really vital. I can tell you the calls in journalism are having an impact. You're seeing more Indigenous journalists. You're reading more Indigenous journalists in places of real prominence. And I think it's this has been a long time coming, but the calls to action really gave it a push, really reinforced it. And it's something to aim for. And as you say, it's like a scorecard. Golf, you can check it off.
You can check it off a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
For example, I think of 1967 and how proud we were as Canadians, our 100th birthday, and the famous speech by Chief Dan George, the Lament for Confederation, and reflecting on what it means to be an Indigenous person 100 years on in Canada, and saying, I have essentially real concerns, but what he did call for in the Lament for Confederation was to say, give us the tools of your society, give us your education, and we will become the proudest segment of your society. And so it was a request not for some sort of, give me more. It was just give me access to what you have, and then leave us be, and we will grow with the country. And I think in a lot of ways, education has become that promise, right? In the 70s, as most of us know, we were not allowed to attend university as Indigenous people, unless we enfranchised into the country and gave up our rights as Indigenous people. But then, when that passed, we now look in 2020 at the literally thousands and thousands of Indigenous students who are in universities and say, wow, what a wonderful renaissance. We were given the tools, and look what we've done with them. So I think the TRC called every sector to find their niche in that way, the one little tool that each sector could be given to apply themselves to make things better. So
you and I have both had an amazing viewpoint seeing Indigenous students cross the stage at Convocation. And it's absolutely, I actually have goosebumps even thinking about it. But seeing students in their regalia crossing the stage, and when you think how education in residential school was a tool of oppression, of suppression, of erasure, of culture, and to see those students striding so confidently and so proudly across the stage, wearing their very important traditional, this is who I am regalia. It's so beautiful. And seeing more and more of those students cross the stage. I've been the Chancellor at UVic for 6 years, and every year it builds and builds. Well, forget about this year. Okay. It's been really sad not to have Convocation, but I do know we have more Indigenous graduates than ever right across the country. And they're graduating. They're not, going 2 years in and not staying the course. And I think that's really wonderful. Incredible challenges to overcome, but they're doing it.
Yeah.
It's great.
No, that there, as you've said, literally, we have an interesting vantage point. You sit in the great chair of the Chancellor at the University of Victoria and look out on convocation. And I was, as the president of Nipissing University, often standing and looking out on the audience. And we had a small area directly in front of the stage that parents could come up and family members could come up, file in, take photos very close to the stage, and then move off to the side. And I was always just overwhelmed when Indigenous students would come up. The size of the group, photo, right? The whole family is there, and often as you look across the audience, you'll see members of communities stand up and applaud or give encouragement. And so, yeah, I think it's, we've said education is the new buffalo, right? It's the way forward. And I think in our sector, and certainly with Indspire, where I'm now working, we're very, very proud to support that. It's not just a wonderful moment; it just changes a life, doesn't it? Yeah.
Indspire, you have not asked me to say this. I want to say this right off the bat, but I think the support that Indspire has given to Indigenous students through bursaries has been critical. And one of the obstacles is financial comfort when you're away from a community. A lot of the students have to work many, many hours. And if they have these bursaries, if they've got that kind of support, they can relax into their studies. They can volunteer in areas where their interests may be reflected in what they're studying. And I just think that kind of thing, not every issue can be solved by money, but it sure helps in this case. I think it's a really critical tool.
Yeah, no, it really is. And so let me ask you, when we move forward, right? So here we are today. We've seen what 5 years of the TRC and its legacy have done, and now we have another legacy. Sometimes people talk about 7 generations, or looking not just 5 years out, but 40 years out or 8 years out. And so if we were to take the near term, let's say maybe another 5 to 10 years, and see what we're doing now, and where do you think this change is going? What do you think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years? Where do you think Canada will be when all of these promises begin to flower?
I want the promises to flower.
Yeah.
I want all the nutrients in the soil. I love a metaphor. That's a great one. Keep making sure that it's watered and fed well. I really see partnership. I see a new relationship that it's the kind of relationship that Chief Dan George wanted back in 1967. Meet us where we are. Give us the tools that you have. And I really think that is going to, this is where it's going. It's going into partnership. I like that word a lot. I know that it's used a lot in New Zealand. And I think that's what we have to aim for. I'm starting to see it in a lot of places. And I look at Jessie Wente, who's the new chair of the board of the Canada Council, the first Indigenous chair of the board. This is so exciting. And we're starting to see this. You were the first Indigenous president of a university, and we saw that over the time of the TRC. These are the seeds that have been planted that are really going to yield something wonderful. I think I'm sounding like Chauncey Gardiner from the movie Being There. but the garden is important. And if we keep the promises, if the promises are delivered upon, it's going to be a really bright future.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think we have an opportunity here. There are thousands, from our perspective at Inspire, thousands of students who are waiting. And we really wish we could reach out and provide resources and support to all of them. I think we're now at about 25% of the people, of the demand that's out there. But there are thousands of students who are ready and have made the step to enter universities and colleges, and we just need to move them, along over the graduation line. I think we also have a sense that as Indigenous people and Indigenous communities, that we're going to be able to take on more and more of our own, the control of our own lives and industries and businesses and, policies. And we will need that strong support from a really highly educated, highly skilled workforce to help us with that. And not even to mention, some provinces where the Indigenous workforce is going to be absolutely critical to everyone's success in those provinces.
Totally agree. And I think another thing that we will see is more Indigenous sovereignty in terms of, Jesse Wente was talking a few weeks ago, narrative sovereignty. We tell our stories. You don't tell our stories for us. I think we'll start to see in school textbooks from K to 12, we'll start to, not just that little chapter about Indigenous people that was sort of hived off, maybe to the very beginning. And then the rest of the history of Canada doesn't have any Indigenous content in it. That's changing. That's a really positive change. And I think that's really going to gather momentum as well. I think about the Mohawk elder Janice Hill at Queen's University, who has talked a lot about extending the rafters. And when a community builds and when visitors come, you make the roof longer, you make the longhouse bigger. I'm not in any way defining this as beautifully as she has, but I think that's something we're going to see. We're going to see a lot more collaboration. And we have to see that collaboration to do what is right and to honor the treaties, which are about Indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful, I think, final reflection on what was catalyzed by the TRC only 5 years ago. My God, I can remember those events. And in many ways, we talk about ceremony, and we've talked about the ceremony is woven through the 94 calls to action. And I would never want someone to think that ceremony isn't something that's deep and meaningful and not as opposed to superficial and one time. I think the ceremonies that we engage in, whether it's a conversation or whether it's a gathering of people or whether it's a national event at the TRC, every one of those ceremonies is critically important. Done in a good way, and have gotten us here.
You're so right. And the TRC began in ceremony. Every national event began with a sacred fire and the tending of the sacred fire. And throughout the events, Mike, you remember there were paper bags that were passed around so that the tissues you used to dab your tears in the audience were collected. The tissues were collected. And then they were burned in the sacred fire. And then the ashes, say, from the Winnipeg event, were swept up and carried in a beautiful, beautiful pottery vessel to the next gathering, which was Inuvik. So the tears from Inuvik mingled with the tears from Winnipeg. And then from Inuvik, I think it was on to the Atlantic gathering. It was a very beautiful metaphor. We cried together as a country. We were forged in fire, and when we gather around a fire, we tell stories. We share our stories with each other. This is one of the things that Richard Wagamese always used to say. And when we share our stories, we become bigger inside, and we have to keep doing that. That's just so important. But I think because of the TRC, we're telling ourselves a more optimistic story. We're telling ourselves a story about what is possible. Yeah. And we know it's possible.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that, Sheila. That's great. And just as I've said to you before, but thank you very much for your tireless promotion of Indigenous literature and the arts. It has been, I think you are Canada's foremost promoter of these ideas and giving a platform for people to hear about writers, for example, that they've never heard before, or writers they may have heard of and should hear more of. So thank you very much for everything you've done for this. So you've really carried forward the spirit of the TRC 5 years on.
Are you trying to shut me up? I want to say it's been an honor. Thank you for your incredible kind words. And Mike, one of the great gifts of just being engaged in reconciliation was meeting you. And I'm so grateful for your friendship. I'm offering you a little bit of tobacco here. It's virtual, but I wish you could take it. Thank you for all you've done. And I'm so excited. First of all, I want to recognize where Inspire has taken the country as well. And, you know, how wonderful it is that you're going to be fronting this organization and continuing the great work of Roberta Jameson and everybody who's been involved so far. Can't wait to see what's going to happen next. But thank you. It's an honor to talk to you.
Thank you.